Olga from Minerva. Today we're going to be sewing up the Simplicity 9456 pattern in views B and E. This pattern is unisex and it features 5 views for unisex hoodies, trousers, and booties. View B is the long hoodie and view E are the booties. This pattern is designed for stretch knits. You can use fleece, sweatshirting fabrics, terry knits, minky, etc. And for the sleeve bands, we need to use some ribbed knit. I think this is a great project if you are new to knits because it is really oversized and very forgiving. Plus, this is an item that you're likely going to be wearing around the house, so even if you make a mistake here or there, there's a little wonky seam, it's okay because nobody's going to see it. So let me show you what fabrics and materials we're going to be using today.
For the main fabric, I'll be using our Minerva Core Range Super Soft Plush Cuddle Fleece fabric in the color light green. This fabric has 20% stretch widthways and 0% stretch lengthways. It's extremely soft and warm and absolutely perfect for this pattern. To make view B and E, you'll need around 3.9 meters of fabric, but this might depend on your sizing. For the lining, I'll be using the same Minerva Core Range Super Soft Plush Cuddle Fleece fabric in ivory this time. To line both views B and E, you'll need around 3.9 meters of fabric, but again, this might depend on the size you're making. To make the sleeve bands, I'll be using our Minerva Core Range Cotton Ottoman Rib Stretch Knit fabric in the color ivory. This fabric has 25% stretch widthways and 35% stretch lengthways, and you'll need about 30 centimeters of this. We'll also be using some light fusible interfacing for the sole of the booties in view E. The pattern recommends around 50 centimeters for this. For thread, we'll need about 2 spools of Gutermann Sew All Polyester sewing thread in the color 924. And finally, we'll also be needing some 1.4 centimeter wide twill tape. I'm using the Stephanoise Cotton Herringbone twill tape in the color Ivory Gold. We'll need about 4.3 meters of this. I'll also be using some Schmetz Stretch sewing machine needles for this project. Regular needles will work fine, but these definitely make life easier when working with knits on the conventional sewing machine.
All these items, as always, are going to be linked below so you can easily find them on our website. And as always, remember to save this video so that you can sew along at your own pace.
Prepare the paper pattern pieces. To make views B and E, we'll need pieces 1, 3, 5 to 7, and 11 to 14. Lay your fabric folded with right sides together and cut the paper pieces out of the fabric. Each pattern piece will have written on it how many pieces you need to cut out of the fabric, lining, and interfacing. Keep the grain lines indicated on each piece in mind. When pinning the pattern pieces to the fabric and pinning pieces together later, use longer pins. Short pins are harder to see in the fleece and might get lost in the fluff too. Another option is to use magic clips. Once all the pieces have been cut from both the main fabric and the lining, we can go ahead and transfer the notches and markings of the pattern onto the fabrics. Fleece is a little difficult to mark, so I kept the pattern pieces at hand to refer to them when needed. And remember to cut out the sleeve bands as well.
When we're working with knits, it is often recommended that we use stretch stitches or zigzag stitches. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to be using a very narrow zigzag stitch so that I can make my seam elastic without it being very noticeable that it is a zigzag stitch. I'll also be using a serger to finish some of my seams and to help with the trimming and speed up that process for me, but you definitely don't need one for this project because this garment is fully lined. You could also use just a serger instead of your conventional sewing machine, but if you end up doing this, make sure you remember where your seam allowances are. Remember that the seam allowances for this pattern are 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters. If this is your first time working with knits, I recommend that you test your stitches on a scrap piece of fleece fabric so that you can know what to expect. You can practice sewing on the machine with the fleece, and you can practice feeding the fabric without stretching it. When you do move on to your real fabric, make sure that you sew slowly, carefully, always double checking that you are sewing the correct seams, because it's very hard to remove stitches from these sort of fabrics. Now that all the preparation is done, we can finally start sewing.
We'll start by preparing the pocket. First, we'll press the hem allowance under on the curved edge of the pocket. When pressing this fabric, use a low temperature, and you can also use a press cloth too. Then, to form the narrow hem, tuck the raw edge under the pressed edge to meet the crease and press that again. After we stitch that in place, we can press the hem allowance under on the rest of the edges of the pocket. Then, we're going to pin the pocket to the outside of the front piece, placing the pressed edges along the marked lines and matching the circles. When you're happy with the placement, stitch that down along the upper, lower, and side edges. Remember to avoid stretching the fleece as you feed the fabric through the machine. With right sides together, we'll pin the front and back pieces together at the shoulders. Then, we can stitch and trim that seam. Our next step is to make the buttonholes in the hood pieces of our main fabric at the markings. Now, with right sides together, we can pin the center back seam of the hood, making sure to match the notches. Then we can stitch and trim the seam and clip the curves. Repeat that for the hood lining pieces. Next, with right sides together, we're going to pin the lining to the hood, matching the raw edges. Then, we can stitch that along the front edge and trim the seam. We can then turn the lining to the inside and press that in place. After that, on the outside, we'll top stitch 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters away from the finished edge to form a casing. You can mark this along the fabric or use the guide on your sewing machine. Our next step would be to baste the bottom raw edges together, but I'm quickly running them through the serger instead. Then, with right sides together, we'll pin the hood to the neck edge of the back piece, making sure to match the notches. Baste that in place either by hand or using long machine stitches. Next, with right sides together, we're going to pin the sleeves to the armhole edges, matching the notches and the center dot at the shoulder seam. We can then stitch that in place and trim the seam. After that, we'll pin the front to the back at the underarm seam, making sure to match the armhole seams and the notches. Stitch and trim that seam. Now, to put the lining together, we'll repeat a lot of these same steps. First, we stitch the front and back with right sides together at the shoulder seams. Then, we stitch the sleeve to the armhole edge with right sides together, matching the notches and markings. And finally, we stitch the front and back pieces together at the underarm and side seams, matching the armhole seams and notches. With right sides together, we can now pin the lining to the garment at the neck edge over the hood, making sure to match the notches. I used magic clips here to make this easier. Stitch and trim that seam. After turning the lining to the inside and pressing, we're going to baste the sleeve edges together. To prepare the sleeve bands, we start by stitching the short ends of the sleeve band together, matching the notches. Next, we'll fold the sleeve bands in half with wrong sides together, making sure the raw edges are even. We can give that a quick press and baste the raw edges together. Then, on the outside, we'll pin the band to the lower edge of the sleeve, matching the seams and ensuring the raw edges are even. When stitching, we'll have to stretch the band to fit. Lastly, trim the seam and press. To make the hem, I went slightly off-pieced as I found the instructions would lead to a very bulky seam that would be really hard to sew. So first I serged both of the raw edges of the main garment and lining separately, making sure that the lining would be slightly shorter than the main piece. Next, I folded the seam allowance of the main garment in over the lining and pinned that down before stitching it in place. After that, we'll cut a length of twill tape measuring 62 inches or 157 centimeters and insert one end of it through the openings in the hood casing. I'm using a bodkin to make this easier, but you could also use a safety pin. When the tape is all the way through, we'll make a knot at each end and double check that the ties are even. Moving on to the booties, we'll start by pinning the center back seam of the bootie top with right sides together, leaving the space between the small dots open. When stitching that down, backstitch at the small dots to reinforce the seam and trim. Next, we're going to machine base 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter along the unmarked curved edge of the patches. This is piece number 13. Then, we'll press the raw edge under along the basting. On the outside of the booty sections, pattern piece number 12, we'll pin the patches matching the pressed edge to the placement lines. Here, we can go ahead and baste the remaining raw edges together. Finally, we'll stitch along the pressed edge. Then, we'll pin the center front seam of the booty, ending at the small dots and making sure to match the notches. When stitching, we'll have to backstitch at the dots to reinforce that seam. Here, the pattern instructs us to put some easing stitches into the front of the booty between the notches. I put them in, but then I found that I ended up not using them. Next, with right sides together, we're going to pin the top of the booty to the foot section, making sure to match all of the markings. Then, we'll stitch that in place and trim the seam. Now we'll have to apply the interfacing to the wrong side of the sole sections. Use the iron on low heat and press for around 8 seconds. Then, with right sides together, we can pin the soles to the lower edge of the booty foot sections, matching the dots and notches, and using the easing stitches or clipping if necessary. We'll stitch that down carefully and then trim the seam allowance and clip the curves. For the lining, we have to repeat all those same steps with only one exception. When stitching the center back seam of the booty top, we'll have to leave an opening big enough to turn the whole thing right side out, backstitching to reinforce the seam. When all the lining pieces have been put together, we can pin the lining to the main booty along the upper edge with right sides together. We'll stitch that in place and trim the seam. Now it's time to turn the booty right side out through the opening. Then we'll quickly slip stitch that closed by hand. After that, we'll top stitch on the outside along the stitching line to form the casing. To mark out my stitching line, I measured it on the paper pattern first, then I subtracted the seam allowance. The number I was left with was how far in I had to stitch. Then we can cut two pieces of twill tape measuring 48 inches or 122 centimeters each. We'll insert them into the casings in the same way we did for the hoodie.
I am so happy with this make. It's truly the coziest thing that I own. I love the fabric because it's super soft and warm. The weight of the garment too is very soothing, and I find that it really adds to the coziness of the garment, although it became a little bit more challenging as I added more layers to the garment as I was sewing. It did become a little bit more difficult to maneuver it because of the weight, but I feel like that weight then becomes a good thing when you're actually wearing it, so it's definitely worth it in the end for me. I made this up in a medium, but I probably could have gotten away with a small or even an extra small because it is such an oversized pattern, but this way I'll have extra room for layering, for being super cozy, and also my partner can borrow this from me if he wants to. I highly recommend that you give this pattern a go. If you do end up making your own version of this, we would love to see it, so please make sure that you do share it with us. You can tag us on social media, of course, but you can also share your makes on our website. Totally free to create an account, and then you can post videos and photos of everything you make and share it with the community. You can also tag products that you used so that other makers can find them more easily. Overall, it's a great place to make new friends, find sewing inspiration, and just generally find like-minded people who share the same interests as us. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!